Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
So the interpretation of information from one context to another is quite difficult. And I think AI is emerging in that area, but will take some time, reasoning engines and things like that will ultimately solve those questions. The real benefit for AI, I think now, sits on top of solid data is automation. If you think of any somewhat intelligent system, which AI is, it needs a solid environment to which it can operate on. It needs to understand the rules of the environment, like any other system, like humans. You need to know you've got solid rules in place that say, if you do this or you do that, you're going to get a response that is pretty predictive, right? And I'm not talking about predictive AI. I'm talking about the reaction between the work that AI can do on this digital environment, which is often everything from core data representations through to, web service or APIs that interconnect to it. I think the biggest advantage at the moment.
Welcome to a new episode of Engines of Creation. I'm your host, Cristian Mastrodonato. In this episode of our podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Denanis Curry, the CTO of Talk Talk. With a wealth of experience in technology and data strategy, Denanis shared his insights on managing complexity in today's fast-paced business environment. Complexity is often used as a hindrance, something to simplified or avoided. However, Denanis challenges this notion, suggesting that complexity should be embraced and utilized as a powerful force for innovation and growth. He emphasizes that understanding the origins of complexity is crucial for leaders who wish to navigate it effectively. Rather than trying to suppress it, companies should learn to leverage it to their advantage. Please don't forget to follow Engines of Creation and leave us a rating and a review. And don't hesitate to share this episode on social media and with friends and colleagues who might be interested. This podcast counts on you to grow and help other people to understand and embrace complexity to innovate and create. If you have any question, comment, or feedback, feel free to reach out to enginesofcreation@mastrodonato.co. I'll be happy to continue the conversation with you. And now, let's go. It's a great pleasure to have today at Engines of Creation Denanis Curry, the CTO of Talk Talk. And I know from many, many years, and we've been doing a lot of things together, but now it's a great pleasure to have you eventually in the podcast. So thanks a lot, Denanis, again for being here. And can you please introduce yourself to the podcast?
So thank you, Christian, and it's lovely to see you again. And yes, we've had quite a long history of things together. Sadly, not seen each other so much in recent years, but I'm really, really pleased to be involved in this. I'm Denanis. I am the CTO of Talk Talk. I've been with the company about a year, and I'm responsible for both the technical and data strategy. And the remit, it really is to support the reinvention of Talk Talk and simplify its technology so that it can really enable and grasp data centricity, AI, and really, really empower not just the people within Talk Talk, but its partners, which there are many, but most importantly, its customers as well.
It must be an exciting journey. Appreciate that Talk Talk, of course, is definitely in the midst of a big transformation. And that leads really to the first question, which definitely tap into your current experience in Talk Talk, but also your experience across many years in multiple businesses and kind of dealing, I would say, with similar, even if different problems. As you know, in Engines of Creation, we really want to look at things from the complexity point of view and how you manage complexity. And so in your role as CTO, how do you see how do you manage this constant evolution of technology across the years? And how you can help a technology company like Talk Talk is to keep staying up to speed and evolve over time? How can you even think about that?
So just to, provide a bit of a backdrop, complexity and its understanding as a component within all of us humans, or anything in physics and chemistry. The moment you do something, the moment that you try something, even if you try to simplify things, it is just part of the physical world that you produce additional complexity. So I'm sure many listeners wonder, and I sit here, why is it that when you hear people saying, how do you handle complexity? How do you simplify it? I think ultimately you have to understand that you don't. You have to accept that it's going to forever grow. It's just part of the natural world. And I think it's not really, for me, it's not really about managing it or even trying to suppress it. It is trying to use it as a positive force, right? Complexity, if you think of a company, sadly, and very rarely do you have a company that do great things that have a very, very simple approach, whether that be technology or whether that be, a business model. Often, even if they do have one of those things, the other side's always very, very complex. So for me, I'm working at Talk Talk. Although, this is my first year in a telco company, the problems, if we can call them problems, and the aspirations and opportunities are often very, very simple. So as a technologist or a data scientist, you have to really understand what's at the core of complexity, why it's there, and then try to capture and leverage that. And that's what I do. I think, you have to accept it. I think one thing I will say, just, in the whole of human history, the one thing that humans have been really great at doing is predicting in what they see as ever-growing complex environments. And the other thing, on the other hand, is automating those things that keep, that provide you support for this, what you see as an evolving complex landscape. And humans have been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. So for me, it's those two things that I tend to, look at and focus on within Talk Talk, but within all my previous roles. Technology landscape, different technologies, different models, different organizations, changes in portfolio, business landscapes changing. I think if you hold on to those two fundamentals and work through those as the prerequisites of your success as a company, as a group, an individual, I think tends to, you probably will do okay within, these complex environments that, again, just forever keep growing.
Thank you. Can definitely relate to the fact you have to accept complexity. And I think it's one of the major things I'm trying to convince the listener of this podcast, really, that complexity to be managed need to be accepted, and versus the mindset of trying to break it down into simpler bits. But sometimes you can't.
You have to accept it. And if you, I can give you a few examples. Very, apart from technology, you have to accept it. Complexity is why we all live, why we evolve. We were single cell organisms at one point in the past, but it was the evolution of complexity that led to very, very, evolving and complex structures, which led to life. It's there. And there are other examples where you see complexity, but it isn't really complex. It's just part of natural. It's very difficult for us. When an egg is fertilized, in humans, after 4 hours, you can say, well, you can see the cells split after 4 hours. And then after another 4 hours, you see it split. And you can predict that right to that second or minute. And at some point, it gets so complex, you say it's out of my hands and it's free will or it's life. And, but it isn't. It is. It is part of a model that is, embedded in all of us and embedded in the universe. So, we're here to talk about technology and AI, but these are the fundamental principles, really, of why we exist, why complexity is really, really important to us and really, really important to understand how to use it.
I can see this is turning quickly into philosophical, which I have nothing to complain against. But let me try to get back a little bit more into the complexity in business.
Yeah.
Now, we talked about technology, and then there is another side, I would say of technology, but I think especially in a business like Talk Talk, like many others nowadays, is key and is more intangible, and it's data. In the sense that data, in many ways, at least I see it as a connection point between knowledge and information, which is something even more abstract and very complex. And the technology side, which is somehow sort of something more tangible in the sense of something you can physically build. And clearly nowadays, companies are really struggling to see data and approach data in the right way. And everyone is thinking about, and there is this sentence about data is the new oil, and you hear it all over the place. And there are a lot of talks and ideas about data. But how do you tame data in a modern company like Talk Talk or previous experiences you had?
It isn't really about taming data, right? I think it's more about having, some people call it a data maturity model or an appreciation of data. I think, that the most important thing in enabling data within the company is understanding the core context of the data that's important to you. So not so much the data oil that flows within the company, but the context on how it's represented, how it's articulated, and how it's mixed and merged to produce information or to predict outcomes. And also the other thing in that context is the realization of interoperability between data. So that you're able to have a representation model of let's call it the information assets that are well understood. Often people say, one version of the truth. But that's important because the one version of truth doesn't actually have to be true. It just has to be useful for the thing that you want to do. And if that truth changes because your context changes, you can accept that. And below all of that are some really basic things that need to be put in place. In establishing that context and that maturity, you do need some rigor within the company. The people that touch and manage and use data, which is pretty much everybody in the company nowadays, have to operate on a standard model so that you're able to grasp the meaning of the information that you're either consuming or you're transforming or you're delivering somewhere else. And the integrity of the data in terms of the company, the organization, is really, really important. So, integrity and data governance are the foundations of a solid data strategy. Without that, you're just freewheeling and you're basically making numbers up or choosing data that you feel from a subjective viewpoint rather than a joint holistic view from the company. On top of that, of course, once you have those in place, you're then able to add to it, augment to it in a concrete way that enables you to, as a company, to make better decisions. Because ultimately, the data within an organization, whether it be, a team of people or a very large organization, ultimately, the hierarchy of its use ends up with people or groups or organizations being able to make really good decisions. And good decisions are based generally on some model of general intelligence, which is based on what you perceive is several data points. And if you're misinformed or the integrity or the context isn't as right as you'd expect it to be, that decision will very rarely be right. And without all those things in place, the feedback loop between the decision and the data that fed that decision will never improve as well. So, often it's painful, getting data structures, data models, ontologies, definitions, and then managing organizations and groups to ensure their methods and approaches and use and resharing of data is, somewhat conservative in some cases. Without that, the whole thing falls apart. And it's a real challenge for companies because, again, data is just a replication of our own, internalized thoughts or representations to others. And we have our own context. We operate within these very complex environments. So therefore you get, various different viewpoints and structures that data represent that are often, disabling the companies from making great decisions.
You touched on a lot of interesting points. Let me start from data governance. How do you roll it out across a whole organization? I mean, especially a fairly big organization. Is like, how can you convince everyone and bring them on board on such a big journey?
So I think there are two ways, right? So you can do a bottoms up, right? Is you pick, elements of the organization or your business and you work with them to ensure integrity of what they're doing and what they're dealing with, and then leverage that to the rest of the company. That sort of thing is really, really difficult to do. I think the first thing that the other way is top down. And, it's really about making sure you've got, it's like innovation or like new technology development. The sponsorship from the top and the appreciation from the top is paramount importance to make it happen. So, we had within Talk Talk a data governance framework, which was really quite impressive. It was quite impressive and it represented best practice. But the thing was that it wasn't really truly followed through. So what happened was it was left to interpretation. And then basically it always leads to discrepancies in points of views, data, reports, etc. So the only real way to handle it is to establish a relatively simple, structured policy, and then make sure that the data governance has a seat very, very high within the organization. So often it sits within a tech organization somewhere. It might be that you have a data warehouse engineering team and they look after it. It might be that you have some business analysts that look after some point of data. And that will never really produce the results you want. What you really want is something that is not strangling, but is a data governance approach, policies and tracking that relates to the outcomes of the business. And in Talk, ultimately it's on its performance and whether the data it's using is producing the results that it should do. So to make it work, you need to have data and data management and associated governance at a very, very high level. Hence my role within, Talk Talk. If you think about me as a person, I don't come from a telco background, but I'm in Talk Talk. I come from a data background. That's because it's important to Talk Talk, because ultimately the decisions it makes with its partners and its customer and market are very, very important. And it has partners as well that look after the networks for them. And of course, that's important, but the priority here is data. So data governance really needs to be sat quite high. And the other thing about data governance in that you need to have representatives on non-data orientated parts of the business. And they are held accountable. You may call them stewards, or you may call them data owners, various names. But basically, they are responsible for their functional area, for the integrity of the data and the policies that have been agreed. And it's the relationship between the people that, are data specialists or information analysts or data scientists and the working business teams that, do the day-to-day operational or business functions, that those things are tied up. And I can say very, with a level of pride that I think Talk Talk's level of data maturity, because of the governance framework that we put in place, and it having the level of flexibility is right for Talk Talk, has made a huge difference to the company's performance and its ability to make decisions. And what that means is people recognize that and therefore continue to invest in it. But I think what I'm trying to say is using it as a somewhat academic, we must do, open-ended, it will make things better, will never fly. You have to make clear lines of connection between and dependency between the activity that you're doing and business outcomes. That's how it works. The bottom up engineering it for the sake of doing it and for the goodwill of the company, if it's like that, often means the company doesn't really have an appreciation for this at that moment, and therefore it's not going to fly.
That makes a lot of sense. And I completely agree. And I've been for many years now, I've been beating the drum of data governance as well. Probably because we come from the same background, the same mentality. So definitely, what you just said resonate a lot with me. Now, I'd like to go, when you introduced earlier and you talked about data, you also spent some time talking about data models and dictionaries and ontologies and so forth, which is definitely also another area very close to my heart. I know also your heart.
Yes.
And it's definitely an area of growth. Now, besides the obvious things we can talk about, you mentioned interoperability. Well, they're not obvious, they are hard, but obvious from the point of view of how you make them grow. Definitely, what I have been seeing over the last year in my own experience is that AI can exponentially leverage, if you manage to do this good work around ontologies, around data interoperability and so forth, scaling up AI applications becomes so much easier. And so I really like to understand your take, shifting a little bit from pure data to data plus AI. What are the opportunities there?
So I think, to sum it in very simple terms, right? I think that if you have solid foundations of data, that really means that these somewhat autonomous systems that are not great at interpreting context are great at interpreting relationships between data and information, can actually grasp and use that data much better. So the potential here with those systems is that you'll be able to automate. So the interpretation of information from one context to another is quite difficult. And I think AI is emerging in that area, but will take some time, reasoning engines and things like that will ultimately solve those questions. The real benefit for AI, I think now sits on top of solid data is automation. If you think of any somewhat intelligent system, which AI is, it needs a solid environment to which it can operate on. It needs to understand the rules of the environment, like any other system, like humans. You need to know you've got solid rules in place that say, if you do this or you do that, you're going to get a response that is pretty predictive, right? And I'm not talking about predictive AI. I'm talking about the reaction between the work that AI can do on this digital environment, which is often everything from core data representations through to, web service or APIs that interconnect to it. I think the biggest advantage at the moment is automation. Going back to my previous comment around, what do humans really do well? And I said one of the things is automation, and the other thing is prediction. So on the back of the automation, AI is very, very good at predicting. But in order to predict, you need an environment in which to predict over, which goes straight back to the fundamentals of having, very solid understanding of your data infrastructure. So they're the two areas I would say. The rest of the stuff that's evolving at the moment, I would argue, not so powerful for companies that are dealing with the complexity of broader marketplaces and competition. And certainly for Talk Talk, that's where we're focusing a lot of our efforts at the moment.
Yeah. And you talked about automation and you talked about predictions. Now, I'd like to extend a bit the context. You talked about context as well, but extend a bit the context and and actually move you back in time to a prediction that I heard you making many years ago. We're probably talking of 2016 or something like that. And you were talking about something, I don't remember the exact word, but you were talking about the cognitive future and where actually a lot of things that you just mentioned now around you could see all these work around data modeling and interoperability and ontologies to sort of bring things together in a way that new knowledge emerge. And it's interesting because, well, I think in the era of large language model is definitely something that we're seeing happening now.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And I was actually sort of skimming through a public report from Accenture that talked about the cognitive digital brain, which again, it's something that back in 2016, 17, something like that. I remember you going around in conferences talking exactly about these sort of things. That was before Gen AI. And so I kind of wonder, how do you see the sort of reality nowadays matching against what at the time you were figuring out? Is it close?
Not close. It's different, right? So I imagined that digitized cognitive capabilities, firstly, and in some respects they would be like augmented intelligence. Something that's not the personal advisor you get today, but it would be something that's more connected to you. I also imagined that we would have systems that so the cognitive processing and the data knowledge would be broken up by this ever-growing IET landscape. So you'd have right from presentation layer right down to some core data. You'd have all these massive interlocks, and the flow of information and the context of that would sort of build a cognitive matrix. I can't remember the actual term I used. But instead, what we have is we have very huge, massive data models that represent a standard like data model and is represented in relationship to the context of various different uses. So it's not inter-system, but it's actually, we've built it from data models. So the problem with that is that they're so large, the individualized interpretation, it can never be used as a digital cognitive entity in that sense. It can only be used as a cognitive library, right? So it's a digital cognitive library, basically, like a library is. Library is print, but it's a representation of cognition. It isn't really an augmented thing. So it's different. I think that the next step forward on this is, in order for digital knowledge to really exist, right, and be an augmented thing, it needs an environment to exist in, right? Like human beings, So at the moment, it sort of sucks off the breath of humans. We provide the model and the data and the context, and there's some basic system interlocks, but it doesn't really have an environment. It doesn't have a digital environment to learn and grow, right? So I think that will come. It's a bit like, the previous, stages of software and device evolution. Sometimes the software was ahead and the devices performed slowly. Other times the devices or the compute were faster, but you never had the two things running in parallel. So I think the opportunity now is, with this big models and the associated connected small models, can see evolving like a worldwide web of AI-based models, language models, basically. And then you'll be able to plug these things in and create reason engines. I think because we have those sorts of things growing, it will lead to the opportunity of interconnected digitization of our environment. The old IoT, which did take off, but you could argue it's not realized what everybody thought it would. I guess we're in the point now where it's becoming a bit more of a norm. But those representations of our own environment and these AI models interacting will actually create an environment where real cognitive capability will grow. I'm not going to predict how that will be, because back in 2016, I had a firm view of it and it hasn't turned out like that. So never predict more than a couple of years. But my guess is it's the next step is the connection to a digital representation of our environment, because we have the library, but we don't have the environment in which this stuff can run on.
That's really interesting. Yeah, of course, the whole point of prediction is probably point the direction, not necessarily what actually happens. But definitely on my front, I had a lot of moments over the last couple of years where I was thinking about those discussions almost 10 years ago. And I was like, okay, yeah, there are a few bits and bobs here that we definitely were looking into. Now, staying on the same topic, but talking about the digital environment you just talked about, okay, I'm really thinking about the future of companies here and the future of the workplace. And you talked about automation really earlier, for example. And I'm really thinking, how is environment going to be? Is it going to be purely digital, or is it going to be more actually a combination of human and digital in a way that we didn't think about?
It is now, right? So the digital environment, right? It's born and copied on us. So, generative AI, the big models, they are just, for the most part, human representations of data, literature, relationships and context of data. And they're just huge. So they're like this library, but they are a representation of human. The bits that come out and are spurt out that are just useless to us. So they won't evolve because they're just useless. There's nowhere for it to live, right? An AI dream, with weird imagery has no use to anybody. So it won't live, right? So, I think it's important to understand that digital AI is just a representation of us. It's actually us, right? So the digital environment will have a mix of, natural and digital, but it will represent us for the most part. I think when a completely separate digital environment that isn't representing human environment, I think that then we enter into a scary space. I think that would be pretty scary. But I don't see that happening. I see, connected devices, sensors, systems, people interacting and working, more and more with, digital tools and data more and more will create this hybrid environment, which will connect the two. Ultimately, an example, we want to predict weather patterns. So we use big data, which is the model that we had. That big model is just built on a number of sensors that have been placed around the world. So you can predict to a certain level, a certain granularity. But when you put more sensors, more devices, and spend more time measuring it, the accuracy of the predictions will get stronger. So therefore, what you can see, there will be a drive in order to put more digitized representation of our own environment, and using AI and these big models and smaller models as well to help us move forward. So I think, that's probably, from a pure sense, a digital environment where AI does its own stuff and lives its own world and creates something completely morphed away from representation of how we would see it is pretty unlikely. Thankfully, it is like that, I think. That's when things get weird, is if we have a digital environment that we don't understand, is nebulous, overly complex, because again, we don't understand it, but we have AI entities that do. At that point, they've mastered pretty much the human environment and this new environment, and we're somewhat obsolete, I think. But I don't think that will happen.
Okay, that's nice to end on a positive note. While you were discussing about these things, I was actually thinking of a few interesting examples nowadays around, of course, embodiment of AI with all the evolutions, robotics, but also, for example, AI agents talking to each other and developing their own languages, which are sort of human-like, but are not,
exactly.
No human can understand. You can see this sort of diversion. So do you see an element of what they call alignment? So do you think it's a real thing in the sense that we have to push alignment of AI versus human? Because AI can be divergent, or do you see more something like actually it's going to stay convergent by itself?
It's a super question. I think that, ultimately, and I hope this is the case, ultimately, the market and the human needs will dictate that the AI and these complex systems that are evolving will be driven by commercial or human need. So it's great that AI can go off and create its own language, as you cited, but it's not really going to go anywhere because the AI that we have today is not intelligent enough to understand that could be from a digital entity, an advantage over humans. So it won't exist. It will just die because humans are not going to need it. So I think that it won't be divergent. I think that what we've got to be careful of is that we use it as an augmentation of our own intelligence. And I also really don't believe until we have a very, very large, very, very complex digital landscape, will anything divergent really happen? I think it will grow if we want it to grow, right? I think in terms of divergence, my biggest fear is more simpler logic that's AI big model based that is malicious, like viruses. That doesn't need a very sophisticated landscape. It just needs a piece of logic that is able to find vulnerabilities in our systems and exploit that. That's more worrying, right? But that's not really intelligent. It's no more intelligent than, let's say, COVID. It has basic fundamental logic that's evolved and is playing out, right? And has taken advantage of its environment, but it's simple logic, really, in a chemistry sense. And maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but just to give you as an example. So no, I'm still very much convinced that, it'll be the augmentation of human intelligence. I think, market drive will keep pushing it on in front of that. If it's useful to humans, we'll keep investing. If it's something that we get scared of or don't find useful, it will die, and therefore it can never really grow. We have to be careful, and there's lots of communities and organizations and government bodies now that are watching this, and they have to watch it. But as long as we keep an eye on it and make sure it's useful to us, I think, it will serve us really well.
It's a positive outlook that I think it's very interesting. And I would say when I speak to different guests in the podcast, I'm hearing different point of view. Of course, there are very positive like yours and more cautious. I'm thinking at an interview with Riccardo Baisayet some times ago was very much into the ethical side and making sure that actually AI is aligned. But I think it's important to keep this positive outlook and also to close in this way. So I'm going to go to the final question, which is the same question I ask all the guests, but also usually find the answer so much different, even if the question is all the same. So you touched already at the beginning in your case, but what are for you the characteristics of a leader who embraces complexity?
I think that the really successful measures when confronting complexity is to really understand what it is and where it comes from, and don't treat it as some alien thing that just exists and is just there to be something against you. I think you use the complexity as a positive force and as an opportunity rather than as a risk. I think for me, that's the biggest characteristic. And the other thing is that remember that it's not magic complexity. It is fundamentally a universal component of life, the universe, and our day-to-day work. It will always be there. As long as the sun keeps coming up every morning, it will be there.
That's a great way and a great statement to close our conversation. So thanks a lot, Denanis, for this time together today. Very insightful. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to chat with you again, Chris.
Free audio post-production by thought-provoking.com.